My name is Carrie Michaels. I just spoke with some of you in our round robin event that we just had, and I'm moderating this session today. This is a presentation of the Nationwide Agricultural Experiment Station Coordinating Group called Health, Wellbeing, and Economic Opportunity for LGBT People in Rural Environments. This is also an extension of the year's work that we've been doing in the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium with Dr. Jennifer McGuire, our scholar in residence, on meeting the needs of transgender youth. So we have spent this past year traveling around the state doing presentations in communities outside of the cities and one in Minneapolis on transgender youth, talking about the research and mental health needs and nutritional needs. And from that, we got a lot of feedback that there's a lot more interest and demand in this topic area. In rural areas for all LGBT youth, and also some of those requests were coming from Extension. So I'm really glad that this group was here. We're really fortunate to have them. The purpose of this committee that you have in front of you is to first create an infrastructure for research and outreach projects across states, and they will talk more about that, and then to create and support a pipeline for people doing this work with LGBT people in rural areas. So this group has spent 2 years developing a plan for their work together, and they're now in their first year of a 5-year approved plan through the Agricultural Experiment Station. And each year they go, as I understand it, to a different location, a different state, and now they're here. And so we're lucky to have them. Thank you all. The way that we're going to do the rest of our time here is I'm going to ask each person to come up here and introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their research expertise, and then what they bring to this collaborative project. So they each have a few slides, and then we have time at the end, plenty of time for question and answer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer McGuire, and most of you know me because I work here at the U. And I'll start with covering some of the things that we covered in our workshops over the year, and specifically some of the things we learned about the rural context where we spent a lot of our time. I won't go into a ton of detail. Each of us are going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll be spending the second hour in highly interactive time with each other, talking through the kinds of things, learning from you and you learning from us. You can ask questions about our research. So my work is largely focused on transgender youth, and one of the things that we learned in working with rural communities and in my work has been on medical context. I work closely with the Center for Sexual Health here at the U of M. The rural context can inhibit access to medical care for trans youth. There's a long drive. Most of the care available is here in the Twin Cities. And even from the suburbs into the city where you can get care, it can be it takes an entire day to access that care. If you need to drive in every month, that's a whole day every month off work. When we went to rural communities, people often drove for hours to come to the workshop, and communities organized around support services, but there was a lack of access to providers who would provide hormone services, providing puberty suppression. There's a lack of child psychiatrists throughout the state, but especially in rural communities, and there were few providers with training in gender issues around medical care, especially for adolescents. A second area where a good bit of my research focuses on academic contexts. School environments are particularly important for trans young kids and for adolescents. And so when school protective factors are more inclusive, including things like an inclusive curricula, inclusive sex education, reducing bias speech, having a policy or a GSA, and providing resources specific to transgender students, students report being more connected to faculty members and to other staff people. And then they feel more safe at school, and in turn, other studies have found that they come to school more, that they have better outcomes. So one of the things that we find in rural contexts is there may be unique pressures to these kinds of programs, that there might not be a critical mass, there might be powerful community pressures to resist these kinds of interventions, and there may not be enough people in general to have things like a GSA or too sparse of a population for that. Finally, the family contexts in the rural communities that we worked with were quite different around the nature of ambiguous loss for trans young people in particular. Most gender variant youth are born to cisgender heterosexual parents, which the implication of that is that the parents were probably not expecting to have a gender variant child. as kids grow and develop, they notice physical and psychological changes with their gender development, and if they have physical changes with that. The ambiguous loss perspective talks about the changes in the family when there's a physical change and a psychological change, and then there's a relational rupture related to those changes. When that's viewed as a loss, that sense of it being a loss is related to our views of gender from a cisnormative perspective. And what that means is that we expect a child who we've identified as female or male to grow up to be a man or woman. And so when they grow up to be gender nonconforming, that's our own expectation that sees that as a loss. And so that's an ambiguous loss when we have a psychological break from them or a physical break for them. They're still in the family, but they're not fully in the family. What we learned in our work with some of the research with rural families, but also some of the programming that we've done in rural communities, is that the families in rural communities came at this from a very different perspective because there was not the critical mass and the same kinds of social resources in rural communities. We have been doing some work together as a group to talk about the nature of place attachment as a different factor in why people are in rural communities and might stay in rural communities, and the family relationships might take a different form as they, in terms of how they're supporting young people around their gender identity development. So that's how our family research is starting to shift a little bit around rural development. So those are the three main areas that I'm focusing on with my rural work, is family contexts, school-based work, and medical contexts.
I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is, I think the reasons that families develop acceptance might have a really different process in a rural environment. And so one of the things that I heard on one of our lessons from the field was a family talking about the development of acceptance within the community and some trans kids in the community, and the way that the community had developed some acceptance had to do with, well, these are the children of, these are the great grandkids of the people who farmed next to my great grandparents, right? And so our families have known each other for generations, and I'm not going to reject that child because that family is accepting that child, and that family has been connected to my family for generations. And so that's the kind of thing you don't see in an urban environment, and that's a uniquely rural process. And when Andy was talking about symbols, I was thinking about rural symbols and the ways that you need symbols in rural environments, that you simply don't need them in urban environments in the same way, and that you may develop a symbolism to communicate with each other in a rural community, whereas in an urban community you might just have a Facebook page that says, meeting tonight, or you might just have a sign on the street that says, gay bar, but you might have symbols in a rural community that are more subtle for safety reasons or for other kinds of social reasons. I think also being connected within the pockets of communities where you're looking. So one of the things that happened, we did a program up in Grand Rapids, and we encountered an agency that was doing a lot of work with homeless kids and kids who were in foster care, and they had encountered a number of trans kids who were being placed in foster care. And so I thought, well, if I ever need to come up, and if I'm going to be doing work with homeless trans kids, this is where I will come. Like, this is, they will know where homeless kids are in northern Minnesota, and so I need to know where homeless kids are. I need to find people, because I know how to find trans kids, but I don't necessarily always know how to find homeless kids, and so I need to know people who know where homeless kids are, and that's people who work with homeless kids. And so if you want to find Spanish speakers, you have to have Spanish speakers looking for them, right? Who know where Spanish speakers are, because I don't speak any Spanish and I can't find them very well. So you have to have people who are part of a community to work with you and work closely with them. So. I I have a chapter on body art. We did find body art was a marker of identity development for trans kids, that their body art, it was usually the adolescent development literature talks about body art as a risk kind of thing, especially for young people, but it was much more of an identity marker. So this is the one I got when I realized I was trans, and this is the one I got when I started taking hormones, and this is the one I got when I came out to my mother and she rejected me, and this is the one I got when my mother took me back, and this is the one I got when I changed churches, and just that their tattoos are the tableau of their transition story. And this is a really fascinating story about, and a lot of people had the phoenix. So a number of people had a phoenix of the bird of transformation as their body art. So it was really fascinating. I'm happy to share that article with people. We would love to hear from you what kinds of things you'd like to have. Like one of our goals is to do outreach every year, and so we'd love to hear what would you want to see. Right, so people come out across the lifespan, and both in sexual orientation and gender identity, and you're absolutely right. Some people talk about it as from the moment they could speak, the first thing they said was, "You have my gender wrong," right? That there are children like that, and then there are people really in their 50s, 60s, 70s who it comes and they say, "Well, I was comfortable enough before, or I wasn't comfortable, but I made it work," and you don't know how much of it was society or how much of it was that they really were comfortable enough. And then there are people for whom it just really didn't come up until at least puberty or young adulthood. And so there's not great research on how those people vary. I have some impressions after doing some developmental research, and there's a few things we do know. So, and it used to be that they diagnosed trans kids as early onset or adolescent onset, but it's not diagnosed that way anymore. Younger kids, when they come out really young, tend to socially transition at a young age right now. That's kind of the norm right now. So they'll, especially in the United States, they might even start kindergarten in the other gender and just go that way the whole time. And the social norms around that move in a very binary direction, meaning that a kid is likely to dress in the other gender throughout elementary school, take puberty suppression starting at age 9 or 10, and then have cross-gender hormones starting at age 15 or 16, transition. And when you do all of those things, you're likely to have a very binary physical transition, meaning that you look very much like the other gender, and to look at you, unless you did something intentionally to reveal that you were transgender, someone might never know that you were transgender. And so the European model of transition for a long time was that, and many of those, the first transgender kids who are now in their 30s went through that model of transition and are quite binary, and for many of them, they never developed secondary sex characteristics of their birth sex, their assigned birth sex. So that we do know that for younger kids, that physical possibility happens more, and there are social pressures that contribute to that timeline. Whether or not that's the identity timeline or the social pressure or the physical possibility allows it, we don't really know. When kids start to express after puberty, everybody wants to slow it down a little bit and wait longer and think about it and give more of an identity development approach. When kids express at a really young age, it's almost the same as when they express their assigned gender. It just seems very innate. When it comes up at puberty, more people tend to want to think about it longer, including the kids themselves. And so it tends to be a more fluid process. I would hypothesize, my best hypothesis now, based on the data that I have, is that the adolescent onsets will look less binary as they develop, but I don't know that to be true. And then an adult onset will inherently be a little bit less binary because the physical transition will never be as binary if you wait until someone has reached their full sexual maturity as a 20 or 25-year-old. You know, you're just never going to undo a body shape that has reached full sexual maturity. And so there will be always some physical remnants of secondary sex characteristics of the assigned birth sex. And so that will very likely affect a social identity. So I think it's hard to disentangle the onset age from binary and non-binary. Is that, and maybe that's a complicated answer, but it's so embedded in what's medically possible, in what's socially accepted, what's politically allowed. It's really hard to say what you can afford, what you have insurance for. I mean, the other piece of it is in the United States right now, it's a huge privilege to transition financially, and in almost every other country in the world, it's covered as part of your insurance. And so it has nothing to do with your financial status. It's totally a medical issue. And so whether you're binary or non-binary has nothing to do with your money. And here it might be related to your money, it's unclear. Ramona and I submitted last year a joint SciFAR with Illinois and Minnesota, and we were soundly rejected for doing LGBT programming with SciFAR, but we'll probably try again. And who knows, the desire for putting federal money towards LGBT issues has shifted somewhat of late. So I don't know if the USDA will be interested in LGBT issues as much as it was a couple years ago, but that programming around capacity of providers statewide for LGBT issues is the next step, is a next step, I think. I know so I have been getting repeated requests to keep coming and doing the lessons from the field as like a permanent installation, and so I'm trying to just figure out how we would do like 2 a year, for the rest of my life. So they're really fun. I really love doing it. But I just don't know how we'll do that. So we've been sort of figuring out what the model would look like to visit communities on a kind of rotating basis. So.